Okay, in this video we're going to be looking, as the title suggests, at Khrushchev and industry. So in the previous one we looked at Stalin and the 5-year plans for industrialisation, and if you remember, Stalin had a real focus, didn't he, on heavy industry, wanted to beat the West in terms of the amount of steel produced, coal dug up, various types of chemical processes to try and compete with the West. And as we know, Stalin did these things in order to the Soviet economy could be shown to be better than the Western economy, and therefore prove that communism and socialism as a model is far better than that of their capitalist enemies. Also, of course, that producing these heavy goods, it means you can therefore produce, if you need to, lots of items for defence. Again, you might say some of those things are not that dissimilar to the Tsars beforehand, who wanted economic growth in industry in order so they could produce military weapons and compete economically with the West. And Khrushchev, a bit like Stalin, had similar types of aims really. He was very keen that the Soviet Union should have a modern economy so it could compete with the West, produce the money that they needed so they could build weapons for the Cold War. You know, Khrushchev was very keen on missiles in particular and the latest tanks and all these sorts of things. So he needed a vibrant industry in order for that, which again is just the same as Stalin, Lenin, Alexander's and Nicholas, isn't it? Okay, this need to industrialise so that they can protect themselves and produce the weapons which they need. Khrushchev also had a few differences to Stalin as well, which I'll come to in a few moments. But from last lesson, you had to do some work thinking about, how effective were Stalin's 5-year plans and his industrialisation. And so some of the points you should have got, these are kind of the legacy of Stalin, I suppose. Some of the points you should have for this is that his 5-year plan led to a great big imbalance in the economy towards heavy industry. He didn't care less about light industry, about trying to produce consumer goods for the good of the Russian people, like refrigerators and radios and stuff. It was all about heavy industry, which of course has big problems in terms of pollution. A lot of Russia becomes polluted under Stalin. Also, it means that in many ways the Western powers were moving away from heavy industry. So by end of Stalin's time, a lot of heavy industry in the West is moving more towards light industry, producing things like refrigerators, cars, that type of stuff for consumers. So Stalin's legacy is kind of, yes, he did improve or did increase massively the production of these goods, but they were kind of almost like Victorian goods, I suppose, building steel and digging up coal and stuff. By the time you get to the 1950s, the world's moving on, and Stalin's legacy was still back in the days of heavy industry. His 5-year plans were always unrealistic, which led to a lot of hardship from Russian people. Lots of Russians died needlessly trying to build power plants and factories like Magnitogorsk as quickly as possible. Many of them lived in appalling housing conditions. Many of them worked extremely long hours, had very few workers' rights. And it also led, because his cronies were in the kind of Gosplan, was the main central planning organisation in Moscow, they were kind of in Moscow coming up with these plans, we need to produce another 200 million tonnes of steel next year, with no real kind of thought about how that's going to take place, what workers they would need, where it's going to come from. So a lot of it was very kind of unrealistic. And what you did see under Stalin, was that you saw, because these targets were unrealistic, but many factory owners who were, these were run by the state, weren't they? Many of the people that ran the factories, I should say, not factory owners, quality went down. If you know that Stalin's demanding that you produce, 40,000 tanks next year, you're going to build them as quick and cheaply as you possibly can in order to meet that 40,000. Quality is not that important, it's the numbers which Stalin wanted. And this leads to lots of poor quality goods by these 5-year plans. Things didn't last very long, things never really worked properly. So there's all these problems from these 5-year plans. Also, because everything was directly from the centre and from Stalin's kind of mind, and this fear that if you didn't meet these targets, then you might end up dead, I suppose. There was no innovation in the economy. No one had an incentive to kind of produce things differently, or think of new ways of doing something, or even produce new goods, or even overproduce. There was no incentive to produce more than what the 5-year plan was, because all that would happen is if you overproduced and actually produced more tanks than what Stalin wanted, then actually his next target will be even more unrealistic, which then caused that spiral of problems. So there's no innovation in the economy. It's all just like, we need to do this way is the way we do it, get on with it, at the expense of people's living and working conditions. And as I said, living and working conditions under Stalin were pretty poor. Again, they were no better than they had been under Lenin. They were no better than they had been under the Tsars previously. In fact, you might say they're even worse, because at least under the Tsars, if you didn't have the fear under the Tsars of meeting a horrible end and being accused of sabotage if you didn't produce enough of the goods which Stalin's imaginary numbers in Moscow said that you must produce. Also, things like strikes were banned and stuff under Stalin, or the certainly didn't take place, which again is different to the Tsars. So you might argue that living and working conditions are actually worse under Stalin than they have been under the Tsars. And it's this cocktail, I suppose, which Khrushchev inherits, if that's the right phrase, when he becomes General Secretary of the Communist Party and Russia's leader following the demise of Stalin in 1953. So what does Khrushchev do? Because his aim is to try and reverse some of these problems. And one thing he's quite keen to do is reduce the power of Gosplan, this central agency in Moscow which imagines these 5-year target plans. And so in 1957, and the other problem he has with these, by the way, is a lot of these central organisations are run by Stalin's mates. Stalin might be dead, but actually these Stalinists are still in charge of these ministries. And many of them are not that keen on Khrushchev. They think he's some kind of wet, wishy-washy liberal, I suppose. And they would much prefer like a Stalin type of person to be in charge. So what Khrushchev does, he gets rid of them. He abolishes them all in 1957. And what he then decides to do is to set up local economic councils to deal with targets in the regions, which are called sovnarhozy. I'm sure I mispronounced that. So, for example, I don't know what the regions of Russia are, but say, for example, you might have like the Greater Leningrad area, just for example, might have a sovnarhozy made up of local communists within the Communist Party. They might set a target for the Greater Leningrad area to produce X and Y. The Ukraine sovnarhozy down in the Ukraine, again, might do something similar in their region. Kazakhstan Central or whatever, you get the general picture. And his political aim would be that it would reduce the power of his enemies in Moscow because their central organisations have been dismantled, and also, of course, he can put people he likes to control these sovnarhozys. So it's a way, if you like, of promoting people who support him and trying to reduce the power of Stalin. It's as much political as it is economic, in truth. In terms of economics, though, I think his main hope is that the sovnarhozy will set much more realistic targets. They would know, what the working conditions were or the factory conditions were in, central Moscow region, for example, and therefore when they're setting the targets for production, they'll take those sorts of things into account. Okay, so here's a picture of Khrushchev in some kind of factory. Looks like he's looking at some kind of wool or cotton or something. There were some negative consequences because, like a lot of things with Khrushchev, the things didn't quite turn out the way he hoped, a bit like with those machine tractor stations and stuff. One of the main problems was because they were local, they tended to only have a local perspective and not a national picture. So when they were setting the target, they'd only really think about, Moscow Central or Kazakhstan North region or whatever. And they didn't really have a picture as to how this fitted into the national kind of needs and desires which were required by the Russian people. Many of them refused to receive raw materials from outside their area of control because they're only interested in the factories which they were responsible for, i.e. the ones within their region. They didn't really care about the factories and stuff outside their region. And what that tended to lead to was duplication. So, you know, your factories in your area might produce so many, I don't know, bales of cotton or whatever, and you didn't really care about what the next region was doing, which led to lots of duplication across Russia. Also, the sovnarchies in the different regions were not keen, if you like, to send their raw materials, like coal, for example, to a different region, because they wouldn't have control over that, etc., etc. And so what they did, because this did become a problem, this lack of coordination, if you like, between the different sovnarchies, and so Khrushchev set up committees to coordinate the sovnarhozys. So you can see how this is becoming quite bureaucratic and quite inefficient. You know, you've got these different bodies in charge of factories and stuff, but now you're going to have committees to oversee the relationship between one and another. So it's getting bureaucratic, it's getting inefficient, and you can see quite as well how some of Khrushchev appointments onto these various bodies, you know, perhaps more interested in power in their region than actually economic goals. And this, of course, made it all really difficult for Gosplan, which did remain this central planning organisation. Khrushchev couldn't really get rid of it. It made it difficult to set national targets because each of the sovnarchy are kind of doing their own thing. And so they can say, you know, in Moscow, we want the country to hold produce X amount of goods. But actually the power of these decision making is now in these sovnarchies. And so they're kind of doing their own thing, which makes it quite hard to coordinate the whole picture. Right, there's only a few more slides on this, but just aware I'm on like 12 minutes, so I will upload this and I'll do the next video just to finish off this stuff about Khrushchev.